Verification, whatever the years. We came out of COVID. That's what I got it on. And the first meeting on my,
For some
I
reason,
got
I
an
did in my head,
executive board member.
what am I?
The first topic was whether or not to continue to keep patient board meetings. Okay, we'll go to. Go ahead, call the meeting to order. Start the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We need approval of the agenda.
President, I move we approve the agenda as presented.
Do you have a second? I'll second. It's been moved and seconded that we approve the agenda as presented. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. All right, we'll move on to the enrollment analysis. You guys are on.
All right, wonderful. I am Rob Schwartz, and we're going to share our screen out to go through a presentation. I'm the owner of RSP. Many of you may remember me years ago when you initially set your boundaries. RSP did that work. My wife also is a grad from Garden City. Can't say the year, it just was before the new high school was built. You guys maybe understand that. So we have some history with your district. I'm go ahead and advance to slide one. I'm Jenna. So I'm going to give an introduction. I'm going to hand over to Jenna to walk you through the presentation. But I thought this is a good refresh for your group, knowing a little bit more about RSP. So we do a lot of planning exclusively with school districts all through the Midwest, but a lot of projects in Kansas. So we're happy to be a part of that decision making. And there's a lot of what we do. You'll see me, you'll see Jenna. We're listed there. We have great credentials as far as being trained planners and different certifications that showcase that skill set. But we also have people behind the scenes that create the visuals that you've already received and more visuals that you'll get through the process. And so there's that element of that type of work that's being done that helps the foundation for when the community, when we do boundary alignments, they'll know that it's based on some data. There's some metrics by which we're looking at. And so that's just kind of a quick introduction to RSP. What we're going to talk about tonight, if we advance to the next slide, as this is up, Jenna can walk you through this. The enrollment analysis, I want to give you kind of an update on that. So we've worked through data verification with the school district. No small feat for their team to work through the data and get something that's going to be, for the most part, aligning to what the official counts are that you would go out to the Kansas Department of Education. So pretty close to that. We've also been working on getting some of the back end information that gets at parcels and other elements that helps us understand how things have changed from the last time we did this work to where they are now. So things with, let's say, values of homes, what was built, how things have changed with some of your infrastructure. All of those pieces are in the process of being finalized into our analysis. And so on our next meeting with you, January 8th, you'll have that whole enrollment analysis. And I wanted to give that kind of plug because it's important for anyone that comes back and listens to this, the amount of effort the administration has put into this, and then our team to try to have data sets that are going to be really accurate. That will pay off in the end. It doesn't put us any farther behind in our process. We've kind of mapped it out this way that we need some feedback from you, the board, tonight to help us understand what your expectations are going to be as we work through this process, so that when we get to the end of this process in April, you have a product that's going to match somewhat what you might be thinking. And when I say what might be thinking, not what a boundary looks like, but what some of the outcomes could be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen one of our planners, lead on this project and let her speak. I'll still be here listening, and when we get to questions and whatnot, she'll be able to help direct that. So again, thank you this evening for this time we can have with you.
Hi, thank you, board. All right, so that was our process scope where we go through the different dates of our meetings. This visual here just kind of goes through what those other colors meant. So knowing this is a teamwork, this is a team process. Our team RSP will be in person for most of the meetings that they're working with your boundary committee. We will also be going out towards the public on March 20th to the 21st. And we will have our original board meetings tonight, and then January 8th, and then April 15th. So what I'm going to go through with these multiple slides is kind of the framework and the different process details that go into a RSP boundary process. So this first visual here is something that's really important as a wraparound to everything that we do starting today into the final board meeting. And it's this concept of ACE, knowing that when we get to boundary revisions and potential impacts to where students attend school, we have this concept of ACE that right sets everybody and to focus them on what's most important. So knowing that every plan, there is an academics role in our schools. We know that there is culture between where the students go to school and maybe the organizations, and the feel between those students and their teachers. And then there is the district perspective of our economics, knowing that we have to balance our enrollment and then have our fiscally conservative look for what a boundary plan looks like for future years. So knowing that this concept wraps around everything that we do, every concept that we'll talk through with the boundary committee, and then when we come back to the board in March, we'll have this concept as well. And then, so this slide goes through one of the foundations of what a boundary process is. And it's something that what we have is called draft, is our guiding principles. And we really want to establish the guiding principles to match what you as the board set out for this boundary work. So knowing that the end result of when we go to the boundary committee and we go out to the public input, the result that we come back with is established and meets the primary objectives you as the board is establishing for this process. So the bullet points on this slide, these are more of our templated guiding principles that we use as a base point for many other processes. And what we want to do is be able to modify any of these bullet points, add some, we can delete some to make sure that you guys feel comfortable and it best represents what the boundary process should entail at this point. So I'll kind of go through some of these, but then what we're going to do is, after I read through them, see if we can update any to better match what you guys are thinking. So the board will consider this boundary work as a part of the district long-range planning. The future boundary should provide even better educational opportunities at each school to ensure an equitable student experience. Neighborhoods, planning areas are influential in how attendance areas are created and accepted by the community. Future boundaries can anticipate future change of the neighborhood. The focus of the boundary process will be at the elementary level. The boundary proposed should continue to effectively utilize district resources. Boundary lines that follow natural man-made boundaries are desired in how attendance areas are created. And then grandfathering student options will be a recommendation from administration to the board according to board policy. So I want to just kind of open up the floor for any comments on this list and anything that should be established in this preliminary set of scope for our boundary committee to meet and to understand what is the objectives of the boundary process.
This is Mark Rude. The second bullet there, the future boundaries should provide even better educational opportunities for each school. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit more?
Yes, for sure. So this would be getting into some of the demographics of our facilities and then looking at there's any program changes between potential like dual language or some of our other programming options that we could improve at facilities. If that was part of something you wanted to focus on, we would include that to ensure that the end-all experience of our boundary continue to have the equitable experience at each facility and just trying to improve on that.
Thank you.
One item that we might add to this guiding principles would be the grade configuration. So is keeping the same grade configuration as current? Is that desired, or is it a change to the grade configuration for next year's boundary process?
I think we've had some discussions about, this is John Weesey. We've had some discussions about our grades and our buildings and redoing some of that, but I don't know that we're in a position to do a bond. I think it would probably take a bond to do some of that work. I do have a question though. It's talking about the elementary level, and we have 2 middle schools currently and how those middle schools or those elementary schools feed into our middle schools. I'll be anxious, or I look forward to seeing how that process or how that boundary kind of lines up to balance those 2 schools.
I think there's a number of challenges here that, and I'm sure in just about any community you run into these, but quite the process to put all these things into consideration that you've got on this list. And knowing that our growth is one direction, but our bigger schools are the other direction. It's just going to be interesting to see what you come up with. And I, for one, am glad you're involved.
This is Andy Farmer. Question I have is, so can you go back to that slide about timelines and the different meetings?
Mm-hmm.
Really, what we're going through tonight is just kind of a broad overview. And then on the meeting on January 8th, you're going to be asking of us to set criteria for this analysis. And so like the guiding principles you showed, are those RSPs kind of general guiding principles, or is that an example of guiding principles that you want us to be prepared to talk about at the January 8th meeting?
A little bit of both. So they are kind of more of our template guiding principles. And so it was more so tonight to discuss those revisions. And then when I come back on January 8th, we can finalize the guiding principles and then have a board action where you do approve those. So they are more just an RSP template at this point.
Thank you.
Yes. I did want one follow up on a couple comments ago about the middle school boundaries. So would it be balancing the middle school boundaries to maybe maintain an elementary feeder, or even balance between our secondary facilities as a part of this process as well as the elementary schools?
Say it one more time.
For sure. So I'm more so asking about this 5th bullet point of saying the focus is at the elementary level. Is it more encompassing where it also includes intermediate and middle school boundaries?
Yes.
any other thoughts along these guiding principles? We can also talk in between our next meetings to also flesh these out as well. But any other thoughts on things to add or to revise on this list? We'll change out the focus is at the elementary, intermediate, and middle school level. All right, so silence I'm going to take as go ahead and move on to this next portion. So the next couple of slides that I'm going to go through lead into that prioritized boundary criteria, where I'm going to generally describe the different criteria and talk about what they mean in a boundary process to provide you guys kind of the necessary information to make a decision at the next meeting to prioritize that criteria. So this visual in front of you is just our current elementary school boundaries. Our boundary criteria, we have 10 criteria that we use in all of our boundary processes. So all of them are important, but a lot of times there's different criteria that work against each other in the end all and when you are comparing concepts. So our 10 criteria are the contiguous attendance areas, demographic considerations, duration of boundaries, feeder system, fiscal considerations for capital costs, fiscal considerations for operational costs, neighborhoods intact, projected enrollment, students impacted in the boundary change, and our transportation considerations. So all of these criteria will be used at all of the boundary committee meetings. We have different analytics to provide information to the committee on all of these metrics. But in some cases, when we compare concepts and when we go out to the public input, we want to make sure that the final concept utilizes the prioritized criteria to the best way possible. So I'm going to go through is just kind of talk through each of these criteria one by one and how it is reflected in a boundary process and give you guys that information of how when it comes down and we are prioritizing these, it fits the goal of the boundary end-all process. Fits what you guys have for the values of your community and helps to establish to the community the values of a boundary process. All right, so first criteria here are contiguous attendance areas. So this is looking at the actual geographic blocks of a boundary. So trying to maintain that the boundary lines make visual sense. They utilize major roads, maybe rivers or railroads, other main dividing areas, and that they don't create what we call islands. So in this bottom visual, you would see how in an example of a non-contiguous area, you would have different boundary islands where students not located connected to one another would all attend the same school. Versus if we prioritized contiguous attendance areas, we would ensure that the final boundary concept was all complete connected building blocks to a boundary. A demographic consideration. This will look at the balance of students in our facilities on a multitude of variables. So we tend to always look at race and ethnicity, free and reduced lunch, ELL, housing types, programming needs. And this list definitely changes for our different school districts of what is the type of demographics that we will be utilizing in this boundary criteria. And what we would do is provide in a table format or map format of what the current demographics are in the current boundaries versus what are they on in the concept boundaries, and are we improving the diversity of our schools and just making sure that we would fit along what this boundary criteria would be looking at. Duration of boundaries looks at the longevity of a boundary process, and this utilizes two different things. So it's looking at where students currently live. So that would be kind of put here in the student heat map. So where our students currently reside, when the boundary goes into effect, what does that look like for projected enrollment next year versus our growth areas. So part of our enrollment analysis is creating a current 5 and 10-year growth area visual that has the amount of students projected in each different block. So looking at, in a longer scope, making sure that we have our growth areas allocated in a school that can accommodate that growth over this time period, creating a more durable boundary. Our feeder system looks at how students move throughout the system from elementary to middle school, and if we are trying to move towards a complete feeder school. So looking at these visuals down here would illustrate what we would be able to look at within a boundary process if maybe a concept creates a less complete feeder versus if it creates a complete feeder system. Fiscal capital considerations look at if a boundary process impacts the amount of capital costs. So looking at, are we creating a scenario where we need to add a new facility, additions, or remodels? So we would look at sort of the fiscal impacts of each boundary concept with looking at just capital versus if we look at it through an operational lens. So what is the staffing requirements? How many FTEs would you need per building in the different boundary concepts to ensure that we have a lens of our fiscal considerations? This boundary criteria looks at neighborhoods intact. We utilize neighborhoods intact with our planning area methodology. You can see in this visual the different green lines and the green boxes. Those illustrate an RSP planning area, which is a small geographic unit that we create that is based on our subdivision lines, our HOAs, and our different natural barriers to create what would be one neighborhood. In this boundary criteria, we would look at making sure that each planning area, so each neighborhood stays intact with where they are moved in the boundary process. The red dotted line illustrates that if this was a lower prioritized criteria, what it would look like if you broke boundaries or you broke neighborhoods in a boundary concept. Projected enrollment will definitely be used, and you will at the next meeting get the full projected enrollment analysis, but just looking at what is our building capacity, and then what is the number of students that can fit in that facility, utilizing this as a logical way to analyze our boundary concepts and see which concept distributes students most efficiently between our buildings. Students impacted is a variable that we look at to see how many current students would be impacted when this boundary change goes into effect. So if we're looking at having an impact that's very low in our current students versus if it's more of a durable boundary, we may impact more students. So this example table would illustrate that in Abe Hubert, in this boundary concept, 23 students would go to Buffalo Jones. That's how you read that. So just an example here of something that we can provide the boundary committee and your team to analyze when we look at our different concepts. And then lastly, transportation. So we do want to look at the transportation and the busing routes available for our different concepts. So this visual here is a kind of a proximity graphic where you can see the different rings of what is the area around each facility and where we have a lot of crossover. So our facilities are pretty close together in town. So there's a lot of students that will live in more of these areas that are within 0.5 miles of multiple schools. So as you can kind of get from all those different visuals, they're all really important and they will all be analyzed by the committee. But in some cases, they work against each other. You may have a concept that has best distribution of demographics for students, and another concept that has a better distribution of enrollment for enrollment projections. Or for example, on the screen here, duration of boundaries versus students impacted. And as you as a board prioritize these criteria, it helps the committee and helps the public work to the solution that best meets your values when it comes time to approve the boundary process. So I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions about any of those visuals that we provided or how a prioritized list helps this process? All right, so what I'm going to navigate to then is just to give you guys an example of what we would be doing at that next meeting. Is utilizing this platform to prioritize our criteria. So we would actually do this question here, where we would ask you guys to choose the 3 criteria you believe to have the most influence in the creation of new attendance areas. See all those options that we talked through, and picking the top 3 between all your different answers would get that generalized list for the committee and for the public to create the framework for this process.
Where do we, was there a grade reconfiguration assessment done pre-COVID? Was there a full
17,
report
18,
and everything? Was
17,
that taken all the
18.
way, all that to completion?
Yeah, I think the board had, and Josh, you'll probably be the best one to answer, but the board had us go back and do a complete study on grade reconfiguration. I think they finished the study and it stopped at the end of the study.
So they did the study looking at, should we look at, if we do reconfiguration, do we want to keep it the way it is right now? K5, and Mark, you're gonna know this better than me probably, but K6 and then have 7, 8 buildings. What would that look like? And so Renee Scott was actually the head of that committee. And so their whole purpose was to look at research, to do a bunch of study, and that study really focused on what would be the best option for our district, not looking at facilities at all, but what do we think would be the best plan for our kids moving forward? Yeah. And the determination of that committee was to go keep pre-K at Garfield, go K5, and then 6, 8, and then 9, 12 at the high school. And so at that point, the committee had 2 recommendations that they kind of put together. You're gonna have to help me here, Mark and Jennifer, because you guys are gonna know this better than me. But there were basically 2. Both of them were going to require bond issues. One was to convert one of the intermediate schools into a 3rd middle school to make it go 6, 8, and the other one was to build onto KH to make it comparable in size to Horace Good, so that when the 6th graders moved there, they would have room for them, and then convert both of the intermediate centers into elementary schools.
Yeah, so 3 options, all 3 had bond issues involved.
Yeah.
It was just varying degrees of.
Yeah.
So.
And I think at that time, the cheapest bond, and this was all pre-COVID, was like 54 million, 55 million. I think, does that sound right?
Yeah, and there were other stuff in there, a little bit of additional stuff in there too, like security considerations.
Storm shelters, putting in some more storm shelters, I think were part of that too, and security.
Yeah, that was sort of a race to get that wrapped up so that we could then move on. In other words, we were changing leadership. There's a lot of change going on. So there was a need to sort of wrap that up so that it was there to come back to, because we weren't going to be able to address it. So that's what's so challenging here about the prior list, considering long-term infrastructure needs. There almost needs to be a sense of that when we look here. But now what she's asking us to do is prioritize the top three things. That's not hard. I mean, to me, it's fiscal operations, neighborhood intact, and projected enrollment. To me, that's the top three out of that list. And then everything else needs to mesh, or it has to be weighed. And as she said, if there might be another factor here in either demographics or contiguous areas that sort of trump the conclusion of those first three, and then we'll have to adjust. But we gotta be able to operate. So operationally, we gotta do it. And then it's a desire, I guess, to have neighborhoods intact, but the walkable, bikeable thing that sits there. And then the projected enrollment, that sort of drives the train. Of course, what you're now talking about is coming back on this potential Trump and say, well, what's our capacity at that facility? Right.
And that's the thing, the feeder system's important, but the way our city's growing, there's no schools over there. Everything's, you look at the map, it's on the west side of town. So the way our city's going, it's hard to do things like that.
It is, so we're gonna have to adjust. Maybe some kids have to walk farther, or the full bus equation.
I think the feeder thing is gonna come into play where that's gonna get complex is when you start looking at the postings, because it's gonna be really hard for all of those schools to feed into equally into KH and Horse Good, because they're not designed to be equal in size right now. And so that's gonna require some conversation, I think, and some thought about what that's going to look like.
What did we say KH's capacity was at this juncture, like today? Or we just like at 60%?
We have like 400 and some students there today.
I'm pulling it up, hold on.
But y'all go ahead, conversation. I'm just like giving you an idea. If Andy, you're trying to get to a point of saying without adding dollars, without a bond, without all that, and still do 6, 7, 8, and 2 campuses, 2 middle schools, which we have. I mean,
My thought is more along the lines of duration of boundaries.
490.
You know, I mean, if we're looking at a boundary study, you know, do you want to put something in place that's only here for 3 to 5 years or something, and then a different board, you know, or however, whatever happens in the future, you know, that's a lot of changes for families in this district. And so to me, I think, getting a chance to look back at that boundary, at that grade, everything that went along with that grade reconfiguration is something that I think I'd like to be taking into consideration here, because, you know, we might need to be looking at 2 different boundary option B. I mean, obviously if we're in kind of a situation where something needs to be done immediately, just to handle short-term issues, then we need to find a solution, but we should be doing something that, you know, would take effect next year. But I would feel a lot more comfortable if it was in alignment with something else that's more long-term, just so we're not doing what's right today, but then having to rethink the whole thing and make major changes again in the future if reconfiguration comes down the pipe 5 years from now. So.
Yeah, of course, we already know we have challenges in structure of our brick and mortar and across the community. And we just know that from some of those studies. And what's best for kids and families, you know, we sort of have and families, but he did it. He worked on it. You know, everyone created a bond issue. And it's almost like unless you're willing to work on the bond issue thing, then number one, you know, you're not doing what's best for kids. Maybe it's affordable, but maybe not. Maybe it's not affordable, but it's doable. And we may end up with some of that. So I'm kind of anticipating, even though I'm not going to be in the middle of it, but anticipating that when she identifies that there'll be some kind of a preponderance of these two considerations here, and one of them was a priority, but the other one comes back and says, yeah, but your buses can't get there, or whatever the Trump factor is. It's just gonna have to be a decision. Part of it's gonna be the brick and mortar. You're gonna try to consider the duration of the boundaries. You're right smack dab into, yeah, but we have to go, we wanna go, this community's gonna need to go this direction, which then means another reevaluation of boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, there may be no way to get around rebounding it. It's just how significant would that be in the future?
This is a tough environment from a financing standpoint, even contemplating. So I don't know how you get around that.
What's left on our current bond?
So I'm definitely hearing like some considerations for neighborhoods intact, enrollment, fiscal, feeder, and then our duration of boundaries. I think Rob had a few things to say on that feeder alignment, just from his expertise.
All right, how many of you remember Dr. Atha? Yes, one raised their hand. All right, so some of these things you're talking about, I know were discussions way back when he was superintendent. So this is kind of exciting that some of the solutions that were being sought out then are still palatable solutions now. So I want to ask a couple questions. They may be somewhat challenging, but what at this point in time do you think the chance is in the next 5 years that the bond would be approved by the community? Greater than 50%? What do you think that is?
I think it's less than 50% itself, but it almost depends on the information. I mean, with what we have now, there's not enough information to even contemplate it. I don't think, but like any initiative, if you decide to go there and ask the community, then you're gonna have quite the educational process up front. And that would totally change the current status, I think. That's data and information communicating, but bond rates are really high. And
the percentage that the state participates is kind of low right now as well.
And it's the state participation is low. That alone is probably a deal killer. You put the variability of a new election, that kind of thing, and it's a wait and see environment.
All right, so basically the case has to be made for why you would need to do something, and that's understandable. One thing that I heard that I think could be built on that I'm going to tie back into this feeder is there could be one track where you look at how you do a short-term solution versus a long-range solution, which would be planning for if you had a bond approved. But I think to go down that pathway, what would be needed is I think there was 2 or 3 different options. Which is the option that would be most desirable? And I think what I heard was what's in the best interest of the student learning experience. So whatever that is for your community, having that could be a way, hey, we solved this here, but we solved the long term with something that needs some dollars to be able to be invested in buildings. That's one avenue. When I come back to the break in the feeder from elementary to the intermediates or intermediates to the middle school, one thing that I think is important is if there's going to be a break, it's the number of students and the type of students that factor into whether or not that's a successful break in the feeder. Many cases, we can't fit everyone into whatever that feeder is, but much of the analysis that we've done in the last 2 to 3 projects has focused on, hey, we can't have a complete feeder, but what is that balance? Is it 50-50? Is it 25-75? Some of that, you can't really place a metric. at least a guideline of what you, the board, might be thinking about if there's a break in the feeder, that would be something that we put into the guiding principles of ideally having a complete feeder, but if not, having some sort of somewhat equal break between buildings, so that way kids can go to the other buildings and still have a friend group. That makes sense for everybody?
What do we have now? Do we have any elementaries that go into two separate intermediate centers or in any one of our intermediate
Yeah,
centers?
so Florence Wilson, for example, most of the kids go to Bernadine Sits, but the kiddos that live in Indian Hills that go to Florence Wilson will go to Charles Stokes. So that's one that I know, and the only reason I know that is because my kids went to Florence Wilson. But I would venture to say that we have other, I just can't think of the ones off the top of my head.
What about the intermediates?
Yeah, they split.
They split
Yeah,
too?
Kids that go together, kids that go together at Bernadine sometimes get split between KH and.
Okay. Okay. What's that?
It's a big decline. Among parents, they don't get to keep three groups.
I just don't know how you pick that number. I mean, other than spitball, say 80%, our goal is 80% of your consistency.
Do both intermediate centers currently split? Or just
Correct.
one of them?
Both.
Both intermediate, okay.
Yeah, and I don't know how you get away from that when you've got such a larger capacity at Horace Good. There, you know what I mean? I mean, even if you said, okay, the sixth grade class at both of the country schools and the two sixth grade classes at A. Hubert are gonna go to Horace Good because it's bigger. You're really only getting about 80, 90 kids. And so that's not gonna be, I don't think that's enough to tip the scales to move everybody else into the feeder schools. You know what I mean? But I don't know. These folks know more than I do, so.
Yeah, I had a question just in general, not necessarily for our district, but I was just thinking about our district a little bit, and I was curious if this solution had ever been used in another district, but we have growth to the northeast and we have capacity to the southwest. Has any other district bused kids from one side of town to the other to not disrupt the majority of the boundaries in the center of a community?
That definitely has happened in other districts where you almost create like an attendance island where that area on the northeast would then be bused to where there is available capacity and you don't have to disrupt and what we kind of call domino effects all the way back around to get that balance of enrollment. It's an approach that I think other districts who do have a very clear density of students where facilities aren't located close by do sometimes take.
How does that go over in other communities? Or how did it go over in other communities?
Rob can answer.
Yeah, but so it's got mixed reviews, right? So the people there that don't have a facility, they want a facility close by, so it starts to put pressure on that. But in general, if the positive to it, it's an extreme positive, is students that are used to going to their current boundaries, they can remain at that boundary. And for the most part in these new emerging areas, those are new families, new kids. So they don't know any different. And the way that you define a neighborhood is not just geographic, it's where you are in proximity with that neighborhood. So if I'm way out in the northeast side, that's my neighborhood. That's my playground that my kids are playing amongst those kids. So yes, you can move them to another building. And so I think it depends on your community on what the success is. And
So under that discussion, your color map would have potentially areas that are not contiguous going to the same school.
correct.
Currently, are we most in balance at the grade school levels or is it the intermediates and the middle schools?
Well, the middle schools, I think, just size wise, they're imbalanced.
Sure, but
because
they're different portions.
Yeah, but when you look at the number of kids that we're transferring, we have to transfer to another school because we're over capacity. It's huge at the elementary level. Elementary is big, yeah.
The intermediates.
The west side of town,
And middle school, not so much.
west side of town, Edith Sharman. They have, they take a lot of our overcapacity transfers because they're running way under. And then you go to the east side, Jenny Barker is exploding. And VO is really growing. And you think about that, when RSP did our last boundary study, when we opened the high school, Chapel Heights didn't exist. That whole housing addition that's been built, what is that, Clarion Estates or whatever? None of that existed when we opened the high school. And so all those new houses and those kids all fell into those boundaries. And so that's really kind of lopsided a lot of what we see.
So is there a way to accurately predict where growth is gonna happen that would be in a line?
So.
And that's part of what they'll do with
collaboration
this.
with our neighborhood development with the city. So they have it mapped out on where developments are projected to go in. So I'll be utilized as part of this study is to look at those.
Those are projections. We don't know like when they're actually gonna build and.
I mean, they have, yeah, just like approval dates of what they're expecting and how many housing units over the next 10, 15 years, right? It's a pretty good.
Taking it all the way to 2035,
Yeah.
I think it is.
So you have the
Probably the
active
best.
permits that have been issued, and that's an indication of immediacy.
Current, yeah.
And so you've got, and there's some high density development proposed, and of course, high density might accelerate kids moving into a particular area.
Yep, and we'll analyze all of that. You'll get that in that enrollment analysis where we meet with the city planners and talk through what areas are under current development and then what areas are even a 5 and 10 year outline that the city has identified for potential future growth. And all of those areas will be into the model with projected students for each type of development. So if it's a current development that has single family homes versus an apartment complex in a different area, we'll have all of that aggregated at the student level that goes into the total projections and then by the different concepts. So if you do move, say, a growth area on the east side to a different school, how does that impact that school's projected enrollment?
So other than general sort of orienting conversation here, we're looking for guiding principles to the committee that's gonna work on this. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, yep, and I can pull those back up. Yes, the other objective would be just ensuring that these guiding principles do match the scope of what this boundary analysis is looking at. To make sure that we stay kind of within those bumpers and that when we go out to the committee, they have a good grasp of what the task is that's set in front of them to analyze over these next couple of months. And what things are not for discussion. That's also a really good tool to have in the guiding principles of what things we don't want the committee to go down rabbit holes that they shouldn't go down. So trying to keep our guiding principles to really an established list of what they can analyze in this process.
Yeah, so none of these guiding principles get in the way of discontinuous boundaries for a particular school if that's the way the numbers and discussion shake out. So, okay, thank you.
Sure.
So we have the growth of the city is northeast pretty much. We have the intermediate centers, Stones and Bernardine sits. That's north and east. So I really think there's some value in looking at doing something with those two schools. Because if we do away with the intermediate centers, there's two schools right there that we can turn into what is needed. And they fit in the geographical area where we're hurting. So I just put that on the table for think about.
We have the pros and cons of that study, right? What's best for the kids, so K through 5 and then 6 up. And then repurposing some buildings. So,
Yeah, I think the one study was, if we would have went to a 3 middle school, Charles Stone's would have been converted into the 3rd middle school. And that would have required a bond because you'd have to
Sure.
put in your gyms and stuff, kids that participate in sports and things like that. And then for me, it would become another elementary school. And then the other one, both Stone and Sid would have become elementary schools, and KH would have been built onto.
That's a wonderful piece of real estate. And you have growth, we have room to expand at KH, you know, down the road or at some point. The hard part, Randy, and I agree with you, the hard part is we have a declining enrollment. We have a shifting population. And we have capacity. It's
Just not in the right place.
It's not in the right place, yeah, and how do we challenge that? So what about, I have a question about Horace Good. Is there enough capacity at Horace Good, or is it even, can it be feasible to use, you know, like, Achieve for a 5th and 6th grade student?
Well, I think are you talking like for restructuring? I would not make it a 5th and 6th grade center. I would make it just 6th grade, because then your 5th grade will be at your elementary buildings.
I'm just thinking,
A third intermediate.
no, I'm not thinking a 3rd intermediate. I'm thinking, you know, kind of along the lines of what Randy was talking about. If we made another intermediate center, we had capacity at Fort Good, we could convert our East 5th and 6th grade school to a grade school.
Yeah.
so.
That would probably, I'm going to guess that would probably require a bond also. Just because like the kitchen that we have at Achieve probably would not be big enough to support a 5th and 6th grade center. We'd have to totally restructure that. I mean, we could bring the food over from Horse Good, obviously, but the cafeteria, they don't really have a cafeteria. They basically converted one of the old home ec rooms over there into the cafeteria, because Lucas's population is so small that he can get away with that. If you've got, you know, 400 kids in there, we'd have to build on, there'd have to be some construction. We'd have to have.
We also don't have a gym.
Yeah, don't have a gym.
How do you, in this discussion, it's tempting because you almost need to go there, but how are we going to ask a group to, and our consultants here, to do anything other than evaluate what we currently have? I mean, part of the whole restructuring was get rid of transitions, help kids by getting rid of transitions, but we're not there. So we really can't include that. For example, I don't think it was our intent to take these old studies we referenced earlier and present them to this group for context. And so it's really an exercise in saying at this point, here's what we have. How do we best redraw the boundaries with what we have? The guiding principle number 1 up there suggests the board will then at some point take that into consider, the long-term stuff into consideration. But we can't ask community members to do anything other than work on what we got. Right?
Yeah.
Visioning's awesome, but that's not what this is gonna do.
Yeah, I'm just curious if the current facility would do that, but it sounds like it wouldn't be capable without some
Food trucks.
I think that would also put a lot of traffic at Forest Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just, in a perfect world, you'd think you would be ideal to settle on boundaries, provide boundaries that work with a future plan. You know, whenever that future plan would ever come into fruition, but I think it might just be too much of like, those two plans, our current needs and whatever future plan are just too different. And there would probably inevitably have to be some variation to those boundaries whenever that would come into effect, and it may just, and in 5 years, projections may be different than reality, and it might not even be relevant anyway. So maybe that's just not achievable to try to make that one of the expected outcomes of this process, is to pick a boundary that works with one option or a preferred option of a reconfiguration when it comes around. And probably just not feasible. What do you guys at RSP think about that? Is that something that can be considered, or is that just too difficult to try to project and create a plan for it?
I mean, I think it's gonna come out when we look at the data and see if there is a way that these two things could coincide together. The data will definitely lead us in that direction, but having a boundary process that prioritizes those current challenges, and then if there's ways that we can move the needle towards the long-range planning goal of, say, what this other grade configuration is, could be something that we work on. But you are making sense where we want to make sure that next year's boundary process does address the immediate challenges before getting ahead of ourselves with the long-range planning.
And let me throw some more information into this for you guys to think about. But first off, we're at your service, how you all want to proceed. That's the first thing I want to say. The second is, if we know what direction you may go, and I'll give you an example of a plan that we're working on now. They're taking 2 elementary buildings offline and repurposing for other district need, but we're also planning for an elementary building that opens in 24-25 and another in 26-27. So if we know where your goal is going to be, most of it is dictated by dollars that you think you will be able to have or that you have secured. That helps things in motion. But regardless, if we have this future plan that may be something you have to wait 5 years to do or now, whether we show a plan that shows what that looks like, or we have to just work with what the given constraints are with enrollment and capacity, we still can have our eye on some of these ideas. But in all honesty, with where your buildings are located, the changes in the demographics of where students live and where new growth will be, that makes it very complex in trying to plan for something where you don't have dollars. So the easiest track is to say, we don't have those dollars. We have these given challenges in certain buildings, and we try to address that. And maybe it's a communication to the public through this process. This is the best we can do without the realities of raising your taxes. That would be my 2 cents.
And that raises another sort of building issue that we know is there and is in a critical state at this point, and that's the early childhood center. And there's some thinking out there anyway that we take that very small grade school and convert that to an early childhood, right? Some thinking of that anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
We've got to do that continues to grow. We either build a wall of some kind, as far as accepting new folks, or we're going to have another building. Most logical is to repurpose one of the grade schools nearby, small.
I mean, Garfield is at the point now where I don't think they can grow anymore. Classroom space.
And I think that's something though that like looking at birth rates across the state of Kansas and especially Finney County will also help us look at specifically Garfield and what that continued growth is, because we saw a slight increase in births during COVID. Major shocker there. So during COVID, those birth rates increased slightly. So I think part of that is we're starting to see some of that influx of what those births increased. It's expected to go back down. So we'll see if that's a temporary or a long-term.
Yeah, and we'll analyze our birth rate information in that enrollment analysis also. So trying to get a scope of what is the county birth rate trend that you guys have been seeing and the relationship with kindergarten students 5 years later. So that'll all be analyzed in our projections as well. One thing that came to my mind as you guys were talking through the different grade configuration changes was a project that we've been working on up by Des Moines, where they are having a grade configuration change, but it is kind of phased out between years. So as a facility comes online, they may move one grade in an area, and then going forward to a K5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is what they're at right now, and then moving to a K5, 6, 8. So very similar idea of instead of an intermediate to middle school, you do move towards that 6, 8 situation. But they have that phased out between the different years, staggered out to where they have the dollars allocated each year and the students are moved between those facilities.
Comfortable with this that we have to start anyway or move forward with? I think we're comfortable. I think we're comfortable with the list that you currently have. If one of the board members has a thought or would like to add something to that, when would be the deadline for that if they put some thought into it or want to add something?
I mean, we can be really flexible with that. So I think before our next board meeting and then before I think that packet would have to go out for your board packet. So probably that week before the next board meeting would be ideal. But definitely, I think this gives you guys a lot of information, at least to mull over with in these next couple of weeks to consider as we move to knowing that January 8th meeting, we're gonna have a lot more information. We'll talk through all the enrollment analysis, and that may already lead us to some things that may strengthen the boundary criteria of just looking at where is our current enrollment projections going at our different facilities. That'll be a really good meeting to set the stage for this committee process. Any last thoughts about any of this or any last questions? All right, well, it's been a pleasure We will see you guys in person next time with a lot more information, and know that we're gonna kind of really iron down what we think this process is gonna look at, as well as prioritize those criteria. So we'll get our hands dirty next time that we all see each other. But I hope this gives you guys a good context of what we'll be asking for next meeting.
Thank you.
Sounds
Okay,
good.
thanks
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Appreciate it.
For sure. Have a good night, everyone.